The afternoon sun streamed through the curtains, casting long shadows in the quiet home of Henry Walker. At 64, Henry had built a comfortable life for himself. A successful businessman, a proud father, and a devoted husband, he had spent decades working tirelessly to secure his family's future. The dining room was set for lunch, just as it always was: polished silverware, fine china, and the smell of freshly baked bread in the air. Everything appeared perfect, yet a sense of unease lingered in the background like a storm waiting to break. Earlier that morning, Henry had received a call from Sarah, his daughter-in-law, Emily's older sister. Her voice had been shaky, and there was a hint of something urgent in her tone. "We need to talk, just the two of us," she had said. The words had sent a knot of unease into his stomach, but he pushed the feeling aside. Sarah had always been polite but distant. They were not close, but something in her voice made Henry feel like this conversation was unavoidable. He felt a sudden pang of dread as he laid out the table, every detail carefully placed just as it had been for family gatherings over the years. A life of tradition, family, and stability. Yet the quietness of the house felt different today. There was a distance between him and Rebecca, his wife of 35 years, that had grown too large to ignore. She had become more distant, often finding excuses to work late or retreat into her study. Their son Michael had become wrapped up in his marriage to Emily, and their visits to the family home had become few and far between. The sound of the doorbell snapped Henry out of his thoughts. He rose to answer it, finding Sarah standing on the front steps, pale and clutching her purse like a shield. "Mr. Walker, thank you for seeing me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Of course, Sarah." "Come in," he said, trying to mask the concern rising within him. He led her into the dining room where he had prepared lunch, but she made no move to sit at the table. Instead, she stood there, her hands trembling. "I made your favorite roast beef sandwiches and the apple pie you like," Henry offered, hoping to break the tension, but Sarah just nodded, her eyes fixed on the table. "Sarah, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, unable to ignore the tightness in his chest. She hesitated, wringing her hands in silence for a moment before she spoke. "Mr. Walker, I need to tell you something, and I don't know how to say it, but I can't keep this to myself anymore." Henry's heart began to race. "What is it?" "Whatever it is, we can handle it together." Sarah's face twisted in pain, and Henry could see her struggle to find the words. Finally, she let out a breath as though she had been holding something back for too long. "It's about Rebecca and Michael." Henry's blood ran cold. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel like the ground beneath him was shifting. "What about them?" he asked, his voice betraying the anxiety creeping into his chest. "They've been having an affair." The words struck Henry like a punch. He felt his stomach drop as he absorbed the shock of the revelation. "Are you sure?" he managed to ask, though part of him didn't want to hear the answer. Sarah nodded, her face filled with sorrow. "I saw them together at a cafe near Michael's office. They were holding hands, kissing. They looked like lovers. I couldn't keep quiet about it. I had to tell you." Henry's mind was spinning, but he forced himself to remain calm. "How long has this been going on?" "A few months," Sarah replied, her voice breaking. "I tried to talk to Emily about it, but she didn't care. She told me it was none of my business." Her hands shook as she held them out in front of her. "Mr. Walker, I'm so sorry. I know this is hard, but you deserve to know. They've been planning this. They've been using your trust to get what they want." The world felt as though it was tilting on its axis. Henry's mind raced, struggling to process the weight of Sarah's words. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Rebecca has been manipulating you, Mr. Walker." Sarah continued, her eyes filled with regret. "She's been planning to take everything from you. The business, the house, all of it. She's been working with Michael to get what she wants. She's been plotting for months." Henry's breath caught in his throat. He had known things were strained between him and Rebecca, but he never imagined this. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, the exhaustion in his voice betraying his shock. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she reached across the table and took his hand. "Because it's wrong. Because I can't sit back and watch this happen. I know you've been kind to me and my family. I couldn't let her tear apart everything you've worked for." Henry sat still, staring at their joined hands. His mind was racing. He felt betrayed, confused, and a deep sense of loss, but there was a part of him that refused to fall apart. He needed to think, to act carefully. "Do you think I should tell Michael?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Sarah shook her head slowly. "No, not yet. It would destroy him. He doesn't need to know all of this, not until you're ready to act." Henry stood up, walking to the window overlooking the garden he and Rebecca had planted together in their early years. The flowers were in full bloom, vibrant and alive. But as he looked out at the peaceful scene, he felt the cracks beneath it all, the rotting roots. The life he had built, his family, his legacy, was in danger of falling apart. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked, her voice tentative. Henry turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. "I'm going to wait," he said. "I need to gather more information, but I'm not going to make any rash decisions." He turned back to the window, staring out at the blooming garden. "Some things take time, Sarah, and I've been patient for a long time." The following weeks were filled with a strange sense of stillness. Henry continued with his life, maintaining the appearance of the dutiful husband and father. He prepared meals as usual, took long walks through the garden, and kept up his work at the family business. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Every conversation with Rebecca felt forced. She had become distant, almost cold, and Henry began to notice the small signs of her betrayal, the way she avoided eye contact, the way she quickly left the room whenever he entered, the faint traces of perfume on her clothes that he didn't recognize. But he remained patient. He knew that his next move had to be calculated, that any rash decision would only give her and Michael the upper hand. He began keeping a detailed log of every conversation, every gesture, every moment that might reveal more about their plans. Henry wasn't a man given to quick emotional reactions. He had spent decades building his business and family, and now, as everything seemed to be slipping away, he found himself falling back on the one thing he knew: patience. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to win a fight was to wait for the right moment. Sarah had been a reluctant messenger, and Henry appreciated her honesty, but he couldn't afford to let emotions cloud his judgment. He had to keep his head clear. The days blurred into one another, and the house felt emptier with each passing moment. The silence between Henry and Rebecca grew, as if the very air in the house had thickened with unspoken words. On one particularly quiet evening, Henry decided to meet with his lawyer, Patricia Simmons. They sat in her office, the room filled with the scent of expensive leather and polished wood. "I need to know what my options are," Henry said, his voice steady but his mind racing. Patricia, sharp and perceptive, immediately understood. "We'll start by reviewing everything," she said, pulling out documents from a folder. They spent the next few hours going over his assets, the house, the business, the investments. Henry had built all of it from the ground up, and his father and grandfather had laid the foundation. But there was one thing that stood out, a trust his grandfather had set up for Henry and his descendants. Patricia's eyes narrowed as she read the fine print. "There's a clause here," she said, pointing to a line in the document. "If the marriage ends due to infidelity, the innocent party retains all rights to the trust properties." Henry leaned forward, intrigued. He hadn't known about this provision. He had been so focused on his business, so absorbed in the day-to-day responsibilities, that he hadn't thought about the trust in years. But now, with the discovery of Rebecca's affair, this clause could become his trump card. Patricia continued reading the document. "You're in a strong position, Henry. If you can prove the affair, you will not only secure your assets, but also ensure that Rebecca gets nothing." Henry's mind raced as he absorbed this new information. This was it, the leverage he needed. "So what do I do next?" he asked, his voice steady. Patricia paused, her eyes meeting his. "We gather evidence. We need to document everything from the affair to the financial fraud. Once we have everything in place, we can move forward." Henry nodded, a sense of resolve settling over him. He had been patient, but now it was time to act. He would wait for the right moment, but he would be ready. As he left Patricia's office, Henry's mind was a blur of strategies and plans. He had learned one important thing over the years: always be prepared for the unexpected. And right now, his life had become a battle he was determined to win. The next day, Henry hired a private investigator. He wanted to know everything: where Rebecca and Michael had gone, who they had seen, what they had said. Every detail mattered. As the investigator began his work, Henry continued with his daily routine. He greeted Rebecca with the same politeness, prepared their meals, and made sure everything appeared normal. But inside, his heart was heavy with the weight of the betrayal. The hardest part wasn't the anger. It was the sense of disbelief. How had things gone so wrong? How had the woman he had loved for so many years turned into someone he barely recognized? But as the days passed, Henry realized that the betrayal wasn't just about Rebecca and Michael. It was about him. He had allowed himself to be blinded by his own assumptions, his own trust. He had let the years of marriage dull his awareness. But that was going to change. He would no longer be the man who let things slip by unnoticed. He would be the man who took control. Henry had a plan, and he wasn't going to let anyone, not even Rebecca or Michael, destroy what he had worked so hard to build. He was going to play the long game, and when the time was right, he would make his move. But until then, he would wait. And in the meantime, he would watch closely, listen carefully, and gather every bit of information he could. The storm was coming, and Henry was ready. Weeks turned into months, and Henry's patience was tested daily. He had spent years building his family's wealth, his business, his reputation, and now it all seemed to be crumbling under the weight of betrayal. But he never let on. To the outside world, nothing had changed. He continued to maintain the role of the devoted husband and father, even as the walls of his home felt increasingly alien. Every day he watched Rebecca with growing detachment. Her behavior was more erratic. She'd often leave for hours without explanation, her eyes avoiding his whenever they spoke. She was clearly consumed by her affair with Michael, but Henry refused to confront her just yet. He was gathering evidence. The private investigator he had hired had been busy. Photos of Rebecca and Michael meeting at restaurants, exchanging affectionate gestures, even staying in hotels together. Each piece of evidence was another step closer to his plan. The investigator also uncovered evidence of financial mismanagement money that had been siphoned out of the family business and into hidden accounts. This was more than just an affair. It was a well-executed conspiracy to take everything from him. Armed with this knowledge, Henry knew the time had come to act. The trust documents his grandfather had created were clear. Infidelity would strip Rebecca of her rights to any of Henry's assets, but he needed to be sure. He needed proof that Rebecca had been complicit in the financial fraud. And so he waited for one last opportunity, the perfect moment to reveal everything. The storm would come, but he had to make sure the winds were in his favor. The opportunity arrived one evening when Rebecca had returned late from one of her business meetings. Henry had prepared dinner just as he had for years. When she walked into the dining room, he noticed her perfume again, too strong, too foreign. He greeted her, as he always did. "Dinner's ready," he said with a calm smile. "I thought you'd like a warm meal after a long day." Rebecca sat down, but Henry noticed the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her phone, glancing at it with that familiar nervous energy. Henry didn't break the silence. He let the quiet between them stretch the tension almost palpable. After a few moments, he asked, "How was your day, Rebecca?" She stiffened, but she didn't seem to register the edge in his tone. "Busy. Work's piling up." Henry nodded. "I'm sure. You've been working hard." But he wasn't listening to her words. He was watching her hands, which kept fiddling with the napkin in her lap. He was watching her face, which was becoming increasingly flushed. There it was, her guilt slipping through the cracks. He had been married to Rebecca long enough to know that she was hiding something, and now he had everything he needed. "Rebecca," Henry said quietly, "I know about the affair." The words hung in the air between them. Rebecca froze, her fork half raised to her mouth. Her face drained of color, and she looked at him for the first time all evening. What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice cracking slightly. "You and Michael?" Henry continued, his voice unwavering. "I know everything." Rebecca's eyes darted to the door, then back at Henry, but she said nothing. "You think I didn't know?" Henry asked, his voice now hard, cold. "You think I haven't been paying attention?" "Henry, I... Rebecca faltered, her words coming out in a jumble, her composure slipping. "You think I haven't noticed how you've been sneaking around, how Michael's been pulling away?" "I've been watching Rebecca. I've known for weeks." Rebecca opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she let her fork drop onto the plate with a loud clatter, and her shoulders sagged. "I was going to tell you," she said finally, her voice weak. "I just didn't know how." Henry didn't reply immediately. He was still processing the depth of the betrayal. How long had she been planning this? How long had they been plotting behind his back? But now was not the time to let his emotions get the better of him. He had spent months preparing for this. Now it was time for the final step. Rebecca Henry said slowly, "I've been patient, but now it's time to move forward." She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean?" Henry took a deep breath, his mind focused. "I'm going to take everything I'm entitled to. The trust will protect me. And you will get nothing." Rebecca's face contorted with shock and anger. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You think you can just take everything from me? You've already taken enough," Henry replied. "But this is where it ends." The words felt final, the weight of them settling between them like a wall that could never be broken. Henry stood up and walked to the window. He stared out at the garden, once a symbol of their life together, now just another reminder of what was falling apart. He could hear Rebecca's breathing behind him, her frantic movements, but he remained still. He wasn't finished. He had one more card to play. "I know about the financial fraud too," he said, his voice low and controlled. "You and Michael were siphoning money from the business. I've got all the evidence I need. The bank accounts, the receipts, the transfer records. It's all there." Rebecca's face went pale. You don't understand," she whispered. "I had to do it. I needed it." Henry shook his head. "No, you didn't. You chose greed over loyalty over family, and now you'll pay the price." Rebecca didn't say another word. She stood up, her hands shaking as she reached for her coat. Henry turned to face her, his expression cold. "You can leave now. But know this, you've lost everything. Your marriage, your future, and your chance at any of this." As Rebecca fled the room, Henry stood there, his heart heavy but resolute. The battle was far from over, but he had won this round. Now he just had to wait for the final pieces to fall into place. His next steps were clear. He would proceed with the divorce. He would claim what was rightfully his, and most importantly, he would rebuild. The trust his grandfather had put in place would protect him, but it was Henry's own strength and resolve that would see him through to the end. This was the final move in a game he wasn't going to lose. The days following Henry's confrontation with Rebecca were tense and filled with an eerie calm. Rebecca had left the house that night, but she hadn't gone far. Henry knew that she would try to fight back, and he was prepared for it. He wasn't sure if she'd try to manipulate him into a softer settlement or whether she'd retaliate with all the venom she could muster. But he was ready. The next morning, Henry woke up early just as he always did. He followed his usual routine, but something felt different now, sharper, more focused. He had spoken to his lawyer, Patricia Simmons, about the next steps. They would file for divorce, and he would pursue full custody of the family business, making sure Rebecca got nothing. The trust had sealed his fate, and the evidence he had gathered about the fraud and infidelity made it impossible for Rebecca to argue. But what would the fallout be? Henry didn't want to believe it, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about Rebecca and Michael. It was about everything: the family business, his legacy, his reputation, and now that he had the upper hand, he couldn't let it slip away. As the day progressed, he received a call from his lawyer. "Henry, we're ready to proceed. The papers are in order. You can file today." Henry's mind raced. "Do it," he said. "I want this over with, now." But as much as he wanted the divorce finalized and the matter settled, there was something nagging at him. What would happen to Michael? The betrayal had already hurt him, but Henry knew it was about to get worse. His son was in the middle of this mess, and it wasn't his fault. Henry had been so consumed by his own feelings of anger and betrayal that he hadn't fully considered the impact on Michael. He decided to reach out to him. That evening, as Henry sat alone in the study, the phone rang. It was Michael. Henry's heart tightened. "Dad." Michael said, his voice shaky. "I need to talk to you. Can I come by?" Henry knew it was time. "Of course, Michael. Come right over." A short time later, Michael walked into the study looking distraught, his eyes red as though he hadn't slept in days. Henry stood up to greet him, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. "Dad." Michael began, his voice breaking. "I know everything. About Mom, about the affair." Henry's stomach twisted, but he kept his composure. "I'm sorry, son," he said quietly. "I didn't want you to find out this way." Michael shook his head. "How long, Dad?" "How long did you know I found out a few weeks ago?" Henry replied. "But I didn't want to rush into anything. I needed to be sure before I made a decision." Michael collapsed into the chair opposite Henry. "I can't believe this is happening. I thought things were bad, but I didn't think it was this bad." Henry sat down across from him, his voice steady but filled with a deep sadness. I never wanted this for you, Michael. You don't deserve this. Michael looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, anger, and pain. How could she do this? How could Mom betray you like that? Henry felt a lump form in his throat, but he swallowed it down. Your mother was never the woman I thought she was, but this is bigger than just her and me. It's about everything, our family, our business. She and Michael, your wife, they've been planning this for months. They've been working together to take what's mine. Michael's face turned pale, and he sat in stunned silence for a long moment. I don't know what to say, Dad. Henry placed a hand on his son's shoulder. There's nothing to say, Michael. The only thing we can do now is make sure we protect what's ours. Michael's voice shook as he spoke again. I feel so stupid, Dad. I didn't see it. I didn't see what she was doing. I thought she loved me. Henry's heart ached for his son. You're not stupid. You were in love, Michael. You trusted her. That's not a mistake. It's human. But now you know the truth, and we're going to make sure she doesn't destroy you too. Michael wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. What do I do now? We fight back, Henry said firmly. We make sure she's held accountable for what she's done. Michael nodded, but the weight of the situation seemed to hang over him. What about the business, Dad? What happens to that? Henry hesitated for a moment. It stays with us. It's ours, Michael. I'm not going to let her take it. Michael looked up at him, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. You're sure I'm sure, Henry said, his voice resolute. I've already taken the necessary steps. The trust will protect us, and Rebecca won't get a dime. Michael stood up, wiping his eyes. Thanks, Dad. I don't know what I would have done without you. Henry smiled faintly. We'll get through this together, Michael. Family is all we have. The conversation left Henry feeling drained, but he knew what he had to do next. As Michael left the study, Henry stood at the window looking out over the garden. He could feel the weight of everything, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the loss, but he also felt something else resolve. He would fight for his family. He would fight for everything he had worked for. And when it was over, Rebecca and Michael would be the ones left with nothing. The next day, the divorce papers were filed. The legal battle had begun, but Henry was ready. As he walked back to his study, he saw the same garden he had planted with Rebecca years ago. It had always symbolized their love, their life together. But now it was a reminder of everything that had been destroyed. Still, Henry felt a sense of determination. He wasn't going to let it all fall apart. He was going to rebuild no matter what it took. The days following the filing of the divorce papers felt like a whirlwind for Henry. Every conversation, every meeting with his lawyer felt like a step closer to the inevitable showdown. But there was still a lingering uncertainty in his mind. As much as he had prepared, as much as he had gathered the evidence, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was missing. It was the quiet moments that gnawed at him, the ones when he would sit in his study alone, staring out at the garden that he and Rebecca had tended together for so many years. The same garden that now felt like a symbol of the crumbling world around him. Henry's mind was constantly working, trying to anticipate Rebecca's next move, trying to think ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he found himself questioning the decisions he had made. It wasn't the affair that had shaken him so much. It was the manipulation, the deception, the fact that Rebecca had been planning this for so long, hiding it from him while pretending to be his wife. What else had she hidden? What else had she lied about? These thoughts crept into his mind like dark shadows, and he couldn't escape them. Despite the mounting pressure, Henry knew there was no turning back. The trust, the fraud, and the affair had all come together in a perfect storm. He couldn't afford to lose now. A week later, Henry sat in his lawyer's office, his fingers tapping restlessly on the arm of the chair. Patricia Simmons was reviewing the paperwork for the divorce, her sharp eyes scanning each document with practiced precision. We're almost ready, she said, looking up at Henry. Once the discovery process is complete, we can move forward with the settlement. Henry nodded, but there was still something in his gut that told him they hadn't uncovered everything. What about Rebecca's assets, he asked. Patricia paused for a moment, then slid a file across the desk. We've tracked most of her accounts, but we're still waiting on the full report from the investigator. We'll know soon enough. Henry glanced at the file, then looked back at Patricia. What happens if she tries to fight back? What if she tries to claim everything? Patricia leaned back in her chair. her expression calm but firm. "She'll fight, of course. She'll try everything she can to retain control. But we have the upper hand. The trust will protect you, Henry. She can't touch it." Henry's eyes darkened as he thought of Rebecca's betrayal. "I hope you're right, but I won't stop until she's held accountable for everything." Patricia smiled, a rare flicker of warmth in her eyes. "I know you won't. That's why we're going to win." The conversation shifted, and the legal details filled Henry's mind. But beneath it all, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more he needed to do. He had to confront Rebecca to make sure she understood the consequences of her actions. The night before the court hearing, Henry sat at his desk reviewing the final details of the case. His mind wandered as he thought about Michael. His son had been through so much already, and Henry knew the final blow would be hard for him to take. But there was no way around it. This was the only path forward. The following morning, Henry stood in front of the courthouse, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of everything his marriage, his family, his future was bearing down on him. But he had no choice. He had to see it through. The doors of the courthouse opened and Henry walked inside, his steps echoing in the silence. As he entered the courtroom, he saw Rebecca sitting at the other side. Her face a mask of calm that barely concealed the anger and fear behind her eyes. She looked up when Henry entered, but there was no emotion in her gaze, just cold indifference. Henry didn't flinch. He knew what he had to do. He had spent too many years building this life to let it slip away now. As the proceedings began, Henry listened carefully, his mind sharp and focused. He could feel the tension in the air as the lawyers presented their cases. Rebecca's lawyer made his arguments, but Henry knew they were flimsy at best. The evidence of the affair, the fraud, the manipulation, all of it was too much for Rebecca to overcome. After hours of legal wrangling, it was finally time for Henry to speak. He stood up, his voice steady as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, I've spent my life building this family, this business, and this legacy. Everything I've done has been for the good of my family. And yet the person I trusted the most, the person I loved, betrayed me in ways I could never have imagined." He paused, his gaze locking on Rebecca, who sat unmoving. "What's worse," he continued, "is that this betrayal was not just personal. It was financial. It was calculated. Rebecca and Michael have been conspiring to take everything from me, my family's business, my assets, and my future." Rebecca's lawyer tried to object, but Henry pressed on, his voice growing stronger. "I've gathered the evidence, bank records, transfer documents, photos. This isn't just a case of infidelity. This is fraud. This is theft, and it's time for the truth to come out." The courtroom fell silent as Henry finished speaking. He sat back down, his hands steady as he folded them in his lap. The weight of the truth was finally out in the open. Rebecca's lawyer tried to salvage the case, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The judge looked over the evidence, then made his ruling. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Henry Walker. The divorce is granted and all assets in the family trust will remain with Mr. Walker." The gavel struck, and Henry felt a rush of relief. It was over. But it wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of an era. As Henry walked out of the courthouse, he felt the weight lift off his shoulders. Rebecca had lost. Michael had lost, and Henry had won. But as he stood there looking out at the city, he realized something else. The battle was only half won. He still had to rebuild his family, his business, his life. And that was a challenge he was ready to face. Chapter 6. Rebuilding. The days following the court ruling felt surreal for Henry. The weight of the battle had lifted, but it had left behind a sense of emptiness. The court had granted him everything, his assets, his legacy, the family business, but there was still so much to rebuild. The life he had known, the family he had spent decades building, had been irrevocably shattered. Rebecca was gone, but the scars remained. Michael, still reeling from the revelations, had become a shadow of the man Henry had once known. Their relationship had fractured, and though Henry knew his son needed time, it hurt him more than he cared to admit. The house that had once been filled with laughter and warmth now felt cold and hollow. Henry found himself alone in the mornings, walking through the rooms that had once been the backdrop to family dinners and celebrations. It was in these quiet moments that the full weight of the loss hit him. He had lost more than just his marriage. He had lost the life he had built for his son, the trust he had in his family, and the future he had imagined. Yet amid the overwhelming sense of grief there was something else, a flicker of hope, a glimmer of strength. He had faced the storm, and now he had to rebuild. It wasn't going to be easy. Nothing was going to be handed to him. But Henry knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let the past define him. He had spent too many years building this life, and he wasn't going to watch it crumble into nothing. That afternoon, Henry sat down with Patricia Simmons to discuss the next steps. "We've won the legal battle," she said, her voice firm. "But this is where the real work begins. You need to focus on rebuilding the family business. You need to start thinking about your legacy." Henry nodded, his mind already racing with the possibilities. "I know, but it's not just about the business, Patricia. It's about Michael. It's about rebuilding our family. I can't just walk away from everything that's happened." Patricia leaned forward, her expression serious. "You don't have to walk away from it, but you do need to focus on what matters. Your business is still standing, but you have to make sure that Michael understands you're there for him. This won't be easy, but it's something you both need." The weight of her words hit Henry harder than he expected. Patricia was right. The business was important, but it wasn't everything. His family, his son, that was what truly mattered. After the meeting, Henry made his way to Michael's apartment. The air between them had been thick with tension ever since the divorce, and Henry knew it was time to break the silence. When Michael opened the door, his face was drawn and tired, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or perhaps just the desire for resolution. "Dad," Michael said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. "Come in. I didn't expect you." "I know," Henry replied, his voice gentle. "I wasn't sure if I should come, but we need to talk." Michael led Henry into the living room where they sat across from each other. The silence between them was thick, each man unsure of what to say. Finally, Henry spoke. "Michael, I know this has been hard. I know I've failed you in some ways. I should have seen the signs earlier. I should have been there for you more. But I want you to know that I'm here now. I'm here for you, and I'm not going anywhere." Michael looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "Dad, I don't know how to process all of this. I thought I knew who Mom was. I thought I knew what my life was going to be. But it feels like everything has been turned upside down." Henry nodded, his heart aching for his son. "I know, Michael. I know. I never imagined that things would turn out this way. But you're not alone. You've never been alone. And I want you to know that I'm here to help you rebuild. We'll do it together. Whatever happens, we'll get through it." Michael remained silent for a moment, processing his father's words. Then finally he spoke. "I want to believe that, Dad. I really do. But it's hard. Everything feels like it's falling apart." "It will take time," Henry said, "but we'll start small. We'll work on the business first, and then we'll rebuild our relationship. We'll take it one step at a time." Michael looked at his father, his expression softening. "I just want things to go back to normal." Henry smiled faintly. "I don't think anything will ever be the same. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe we need to change, to grow, to make sure we're stronger than before." Michael nodded slowly. "I guess you're right." For the first time in weeks, Henry felt a sense of hope stir inside him. The road ahead would be long, but he wasn't walking it alone. With time and patience, he and Michael would rebuild. As he left Michael's apartment that evening, Henry felt something shift inside him. The past had hurt and the scars would remain, but it was in those moments of rebuilding, of making something stronger from the broken pieces, that Henry realized the true meaning of strength. The life he had built was no longer about the family business or the wealth. It was about relationships, about loyalty, love, and trust. And as long as he had that, he could rebuild anything. The next morning, Henry returned to the office, determined to get to work. He called a meeting with his team, all of whom had stood by him through the worst of the storm. "We're going to make this business stronger than it's ever been," he told them. "We're going to rebuild from the ground up, and we're going to do it together. We're not just surviving anymore, we're thriving." As the meeting progressed, Henry could feel the energy in the room shift. There was a new sense of purpose, a renewed sense of determination. The business would survive. No, it would thrive, and Henry would make sure of it. He was no longer the man who would let things fall apart. He was the man who would rebuild. And with that, he realized something even more important, and the rebuilding wasn't just about business, it was about life. It was about finding the strength to rise from the ashes no matter what had been lost. It had been 2 months since the court ruling, and while Henry was starting to rebuild his life in the family business, there were still lingering shadows from the past. Rebecca's betrayal, the financial fraud, the affair, these things were still raw, even as he moved forward with renewed purpose. Henry had taken control of the company, working side by side with his trusted team to regain its strength and reputation. But the one thing that still weighed heavily on his heart was the need for justice, not just for the betrayal he had suffered, but for the pain his son Michael had gone through. And it was now that Henry's path crossed a new chapter of revelation, one that would shatter any remaining illusions about what Rebecca and Michael had done. One morning, Henry was sitting in his office reviewing a financial report when his phone rang. It was Patricia Simmons, his lawyer. He picked it up with a slight sense of dread. "Henry, we've got something," she said, her voice tight, "something that could change everything." Henry's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? You need to meet me at my office. We've uncovered something from the investigation that you're not going to believe." Henry stood up immediately, the urgency in Patricia's voice compelling him to act. He drove to Patricia's office, his mind racing with questions. When he arrived, Patricia wasted no time in handing him a folder filled with documents. As he flipped through them, the first thing that caught his eye was the life insurance policy, a policy that had been signed in his name. The signature, however, wasn't his, it was Rebecca's. "This is a forgery," Henry said, his voice darkening as he examined the documents. "Yes, it is," Patricia confirmed, "and it gets worse. According to the private investigator's report, Rebecca had been planning to cash in on your death." Henry felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you saying?" Patricia looked at him with serious eyes. "We found evidence that Rebecca was not only planning the divorce but also had designs on your life insurance. She wanted to collect your policy after your death and leave everything to herself and Michael." The implications of this hit Henry like a punch to the gut. His mind raced with images of Rebecca, of how well she had hidden her true intentions. He had thought she was just after the money, but this was something far more sinister. "But that's not all," Patricia added, her voice low. "We also found deleted emails that had been recovered from Rebecca's phone. She had been researching undetectable poisons and digitalis overdose symptoms." Henry's breath caught in his throat. "She poisoned Elena," he whispered, barely able to comprehend the words. "Elena's death wasn't natural." Patricia continued. "We've also exhumed her body, and the medical examiner confirmed traces of digitalis. Rebecca was not just planning to steal from you, she was involved in murder." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Henry absorbed the weight of this revelation. Elena, his sister-in-law, Rebecca's closest relative, had died under mysterious circumstances 2 years ago. Henry had never questioned the official cause of death, a heart attack. But now everything made sense. The death, the timing, the inheritance. It had all been part of Rebecca's grand scheme. Henry stood up, his mind reeling. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "We take this to the authorities," Patricia said. "This is first-degree murder, and with the evidence we have, we can make sure Rebecca is held accountable." Henry nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. He had wanted justice for the betrayal, but this was something far darker. It wasn't just about the business, the affair, or even the money. It was about a life that had been taken. And it was time for Rebecca to face the consequences of her actions. The next few days were a blur of legal proceedings, police interviews, and the gathering of more evidence. Patricia worked tirelessly to ensure everything was in order while Henry tried to process what he had learned. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal that haunted him. It was the fact that Rebecca's manipulations had extended far beyond the family business, touching the lives of those he loved. But as hard as it was, Henry knew that he couldn't allow this darkness to continue. He had to see it through. Finally, the day came when Rebecca was arrested. The police came to her apartment, and the scene that followed was like something out of a thriller. She was handcuffed, her designer clothes disheveled, her expression one of shock and disbelief. She screamed, denied everything, and tried to run, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Rebecca was taken into custody, and soon the media was all over the case. "Oceolite's deadly deception," the headlines screamed. "Murder and fraud. The fall of Rebecca Walker." It was the kind of publicity Henry had never wanted but knew was necessary to expose the truth. Meanwhile, the legal battle against Rebecca's fraud schemes continued. The bank records, the forged documents, the fraudulent transfers, everything was being laid bare for the world to see. But the greatest revelation was the confirmation of Elena's murder. The exhumation, the traces of poison, and the emails linking Rebecca to the crime were all irrefutable evidence. As the case moved forward, Henry watched from the sidelines, knowing that justice was finally being served, but still feeling the weight of the losses. He had fought so hard to protect his family and his legacy, and now it was all being torn apart in the courtroom. But he couldn't look away. He had to stay strong. The trial came a few weeks later, and Rebecca's lawyers tried to spin a story of misunderstood ambition and poor choices. They claimed that Rebecca had acted out of desperation, that she had never meant for anyone to be harmed. But the jury wasn't fooled. The evidence was clear. Rebecca was found guilty of first-degree murder and several counts of fraud. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the gavel fell, Henry felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. It wasn't the kind of justice that could erase the pain of the past or bring back what was lost. But it was justice. Elena's death had not been in vain. Rebecca's manipulation, her greed, her cruelty, they had all been exposed for the world to see. The Walker family had been through hell, but they had survived. Henry looked over at Michael, who had been by his side through every step of the process. He was standing tall now, no longer the broken man who had walked into the courthouse weeks earlier. "It's over, Dad," Michael said, his voice steady. Henry nodded. "It's over." And for the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. He had lost so much, but he had gained something too. He had learned that sometimes the greatest battles weren't fought with weapons or money, but with the truth. And the truth had set them free. The family, though scarred, would rebuild. And Henry would make sure of that. It wasn't just about the legacy or the business. It was about the people he loved, the ones who had stood by him. And now they could begin again. The weeks following Rebecca's conviction were some of the most difficult of Henry's life. But they were also the beginning of something new. The weight of betrayal and loss had taken its toll on him, but now for the first time in months, he felt a sense of clarity. The storm had passed, and it was time to rebuild not just his business, but his life. Henry had always been a man of action, a man who preferred to control his destiny. But this was different. The aftermath of everything that had happened forced him to reconsider what truly mattered. The business, while important, was no longer the focal point of his existence. His family, his son, his friends, and even the few loyal employees who had stood by him were what mattered most. The Walker family was shattered, but it wasn't beyond repair, and Henry was determined to rebuild what had been lost. That evening, as Henry sat alone in his office staring out at the garden that had witnessed so many years of his life, he was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Michael. "Can I come in?" his son asked, his voice softer than usual. Henry nodded and gestured to the chair across from him. "Of course, son. Come on in." Michael walked in and sat down, his eyes heavy with emotion. He had changed since the trial. He was no longer the young man who had been consumed by pain and disbelief. He was stronger, more grounded, but there was still a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot." Michael began, his voice quiet but steady. "About everything that's happened, about Mom, about everything you've done for me." Henry watched his son closely. "What are you thinking?" "Michael." Michael took a deep breath. "I'm thinking that I don't want to let her define me anymore. I don't want to carry this anger and resentment for the rest of my life. I want to move forward. I want to rebuild my life, my future, and I want you to be a part of that." Henry felt a swell of pride and relief. He had watched his son struggle with the weight of Rebecca's betrayal, but now he saw the man Michael was becoming. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but he had grown. "I'm proud of you, Michael," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "It hasn't been easy, but you're doing the right thing. We'll rebuild together." Michael nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. "I've been thinking about the business too. I know it's important to you, Dad, but I want to help. I want to be a part of it. I want to make it something that's ours, not something that's been tainted by what Mom did." Henry's heart swelled at his son's words. The business had always been Henry's pride and joy, but now it wasn't just about the money or the legacy, it was about family. It was about rebuilding what they had lost one step at a time. "You're right, Michael," Henry said. "This business is ours now. We're going to make it something better than it ever was, and we'll do it together." Over the next few months, the Walker family slowly began to heal. The business, under Henry's guidance and Michael's newfound dedication, started to thrive again. They brought in new clients, rebuilt old relationships, and found a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, still remnants of the pain Rebecca had caused, but with each passing day, the future became clearer. Henry also found himself rediscovering his own sense of self. For so many years, he had defined himself by his marriage, his family, and his business. But now, as he started to rebuild, he realized that he didn't need to be defined by anyone but himself. He was Henry Walker, and he could rebuild anything. He started to take time for himself, something he hadn't done in years. He went for walks in the park, started taking up hobbies he had neglected, and even began dating again. At first it felt strange, but with time he began to enjoy the freedom that came with rediscovering who he was outside of the roles he had always played. One evening, as he walked through the garden, Henry reflected on how far they had come. The roses were blooming again just as they had in the past, their vibrant colors standing out against the lush greenery. It was a symbol of the rebirth that was taking place not just in the garden, but in his life. That night, over dinner with Michael and a few close friends, Henry raised a glass. To new beginnings, he said, his voice steady but filled with hope. To the family we rebuild, the legacy we create, and the lessons we learn along the way. They all raised their glasses in unison, and for the first time in months, Henry felt at peace. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. As the evening went on, Henry looked around the table at his son, his loyal employees, and the friends who had supported him through the darkest times. This was his true wealth. Not the business, not the money, but the people who stood by him. The people who had shown him that no matter what happened, family could still be the foundation of everything. Rebecca's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also revealed the strength of the Walker family. They had faced the storm and come out stronger. Now, they would face the future together. And this time, nothing would tear them apart. The next morning, Henry sat at his desk looking out at the garden once more. He felt a sense of calm wash over him as he thought about everything they had been through and everything they had yet to build. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Henry knew one thing: he would face it with his head held high, ready to rebuild his life, his family, and his legacy one day at a time. The wind rustled through the trees, and the first flowers of spring bloomed in the garden. Henry smiled, knowing that the cycle of life, like the seasons, would continue with new beginnings and the promise of brighter days ahead.